you working at home or are you working
I'm in
at
the office right now.
I guess it's got to be really tough with the toddler at home.
Right. Yeah, a 2-year-old at home makes it hard to do a lot of things.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
if there's nobody here, I'm helping hold down the fort and make sure that the research uh, is all being done in kind of compliance with COVID safety.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we are at 3:31.
Okay.
Do you want to go ahead, Ross? Introduction.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the NC State Geospatial Forum. I'm Ross Meentemeyer, Director of the Center for Geospatial Analytics. And today we're going to learn about Dr. Jen Richmond-Bryant's work, which takes a mixed methods geospatial approach to community engaged research. It's really a pleasure to introduce Dr. Richmond-Bryant. She's a new CGA faculty fellow, advises one of our new PhD students. She's also an associate professor of the practice in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources. I think that means she actually really knows what she's doing.
Or good at pretending.
Specializing in human exposure to air pollution, Dr. Richmond-Bryant has a tremendous amount of professional expertise and experience working as an exposure assessment expert in the Center for Environmental Assessment at the Environmental Protection Agency, the US EPA. And before that, as an assistant professor of urban public health at the City University of New York. And her fascinating research has been published in lots of leading journals focused on kind of the intersection of environmental science and public health. And so welcome, Jen. I really look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Ross. And thank you guys for joining me today. I think this is probably going to be one of the less technical presentations of probably the series. I do hope that we can come back and give a little bit more of an update when we start doing some of the cool geospatial modeling of our air quality results. And I'm going to take you through this project in a few minutes. But I do want to take a minute to acknowledge all of my co-authors on this work. Matilda O'Dara is a Master of Science student in Natural Resources and has done a lot of the oral history work that I'm going to be talking about today. Jen Irving and Margaret Reams are both colleagues from LSU who work on the community engagement aspect of this process and have been really vital to the work. Mikiko Shukunobe is with the Center for Geospatial Analytics and is in the process of designing and building an app that we're going to be using as part of this work. I'm going to be talking about that towards the end of the study. Chuchi Guo is a new postdoc working with me, and she's actually stationed in Louisiana because she's going to be doing the field study, running the field study there. She just finished her PhD at LSU, and it actually seemed cheaper to leave her there than to bring her back here and pay for travel. So she's going to be actually the hands-on lab analysis setup person. And then Martine Mathieu, who's a first year CGA PhD student, is going to be doing a lot of the geospatial modeling of the results that we get from Chuchi's fieldwork. So, so I'll be introducing you to some of this today. And like I said, hopefully, because we're just at the beginning of this grant, in about 2 years, we'll have a lot of really cool, interesting things to share. But I want to just give you a little bit of an overview of this project. We're funded by the Superfund Research Program. This is the Louisiana State University program. We're actually in a subcontract to them. And what we're doing is studying something called an environmentally persistent free radical. An environmentally persistent free radical, or I might refer to it as EPFRs, is basically like a conjugate of a stable material with some kind of oxidizing structure. So it's like a metal with a free oxidant conjugated to it, or some kind of aromatic carbon with an oxidative fragment. And so this particular material has been studied by LSU for about 2 decades. This is the second Superfund Research Center that they've had, and they wanted to add on an exposure assessment component to it. A couple of years ago, a colleague of mine at EPA, before I came over here, was contacted, and he kind of said to them, well, I don't really do a lot of original research, but I have a colleague who might be interested, and he connected me with them. And we started talking and making plans, and we have developed this kind of comprehensive field study to complement a lot of the laboratory work that they're doing to see how mice respond to this material, and to try to develop ways to characterize it with instrumentation. So my exposure assessment study is sort of wedged right in the middle of all of that. So our goal for this particular study is not just to go in and measure in a community, but we wanted really for this to be a community engaged experience where we're benefiting from all of the insight and experience and observations of community members. And so one of our goals really has been to partner with communities to support collective and individual actions that can help to reduce their exposures. We're studying this town, Colfax, Louisiana, because it's home to a thermal treatment facility that handles hazardous waste. I'll tell you a little bit more about that on the next slide. We're in the process of developing a community engaged air pollutant monitoring program. And part of that work will be translating findings back to the residents. And that's actually some of where Makiko's app comes in. Try to move to the next slide. So this shows you a bit about our source. Clean Harbors company operates an open burn, open detonation facility. It's the only commercial operation of its type in the US. Hopefully there will be no more of these at some point in the near future. What they do is basically treat energetic reactive waste, a lot of military munitions. They take in fireworks from Disney World. I was trying to think of some kind of play on the most magical place in the world. This is definitely not that. But basically what they do is they take waste, and you can see in this picture on the right, an image of this facility. And if we kind of focus on the front, you can see a pan that's not in use. They have these concrete burn pads. And then metal is, there's like a metal plate on top of that. And they literally pile on the waste onto this plate, douse it with gasoline, light it on fire, and detonate it. And they store about 50,000 pounds of waste on site during that time. Just to give you a little bit of a history of this site, it's been in operation for 40 years, and it's changed hands a number of times in that process. The current owners and operators, Clean Harbor, purchased it 18 years ago. They basically put in place some plans to remediate the facility, but then in 2012, something happened a few, I guess maybe 50, 100 miles north of there in Camp Minden, which is a military facility in Louisiana, in northern Louisiana. They were storing 15 million pounds of waste, explosive waste, improperly. And so they figured this out because there was an explosion, and it was a terrible tragedy. But at the same time, while they had to curtail any kind of operation at Camp Minden, they were doing something similar with the waste up there. They started shipping some of these munitions down to Colfax. Colfax received the first shipment of explosive waste from Camp Minden in 2014. And that's when the experience of the people in the town really started to change at that point. Clean Harbors, over a 4-year or so period, put in a number of requests to increase their waste treatment plan by 3- to 5-fold. And finally, at the beginning of this year, the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality denied their permit. without them doing any kind of modification. I apologize for my dog, by the way, she is barking, but I will try to just kind of power through it. And if you miss something, please don't hesitate to just pop in and ask. So anyway, the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality denied the permit. Clean Harbors immediately appealed that. And when they're in an appeal state, they can actually just keep operating as they were. The company gets the benefit of the doubt, at least in Louisiana, and can keep operating until there's a final decision made. In late August, the facility actually proposed an enclosed design. So that would be a tremendous improvement, although it's not clear if all of the design characteristics are appropriate for the community. There's still a lot of concern about waste and increasing the amount of waste that they process there. It could also take years for them to actually implement this design. So we're working really closely with the community. You can see the Zoom picture on the right. I'm actually not in this, although I was in the meeting. But these are some of my colleagues from Louisiana State University during one of our quarterly meetings. This one was back in July. And you can see on the picture we have on the left-hand side, third from the top, you can see Reverend Lewis Swafford, who's a community member there. Bottom right, we have Brenda Valley, who actually meets with us right now on a bi-weekly basis. So we're in touch with her quite frequently. And Brenda is the organizer of the Central Louisiana Coalition for a Clean and Healthy Environment, and they're partnering with us. We've also been partnering with another group that's well-known called the Louisiana Environmental Action Network, and they've worked on many environmental justice cases over the years. And we're really trying to meet the community where they are to introduce our work to residents, establish connections, and that will give us tremendous insight to data gathering. So really what I'm going to talk with you guys about today when we get down to the mapping portion of this work is how we're using these community insights from a few different sources to try to map out what people have seen and heard and experienced. And then once we do that, then we are using that to design our air quality study. And you'll see some of the mapping that plays into that. So our objectives for this study are first to involve the Colfax community in the study design. We want this to be really an earnest partnership with the community, not just a check the box kind of thing. Our big contribution is our second aim, which I'm not ready to talk about since we haven't done it yet, but that'll be characterizing concentrations of that material environmentally persistent free radicals. We're also going to be working to characterize other contaminants in the Colfax air, and the information about which ones we characterize has come largely from our interviews and other sources of information that I'll talk about in a little while. We want to report concentrations and health conditions back to community members. We're designing that app to do that. Makiko is really taking the lead on that design. We're also going to be characterizing pollution infiltration indoors by taking dust samples towards the end of the study. And we'd like to evaluate how this information empowers the Colfax community. We hope that once we have concentrations in hand for them, that will be a real tremendous aid, because the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality has taken measurements, but they've been conducted in such a way that they haven't really resulted in any kind of insights. They've actually been taken in such a way that they might not result in insights for the kind of waste and what they measure. But anyway, that's a little bit of an aside. So our aim is to engage the Colfax community, our first aim of this study, and we want to determine if partnering with the Colfax community on plans for assessing exposure from hazardous waste thermal treatment emissions will promote community empowerment and engagement. And we hypothesize basically that it will. The picture on the bottom right was from an article that was published in ProPublica 3 years ago. The silhouette image is of Brenda Valley. She's our community partner, and you can see one of our community partners, and you can see off in the distance this cloud of smoke from the facility. And this is really a constant pervasive factor in the lives of the people who live there. So again, we're all about community engagement, but I would be really remiss if I didn't explain a bit about how that has changed in the last year, because we were funded to start this project in March. Actually, technically, because we're a subcontract, we just got the funding in hand from LSU here a few weeks ago. But pre-COVID, we were planning to take a number of trips to meet with community members through a focus group forum so that we could gather insights on our air quality sampling design process. And we were hoping that by meeting with groups of people, we could benefit from that kind of collective knowledge and institutional knowledge that you have when you bring a group of people together who've lived in a place for a long time. But that's not possible due to COVID. Both because of travel and because it's irresponsible right now for us to bring together a group of people. And so we've replaced this activity with a few other things. Number one is we've done a deep dive into public comments that were offered through a excuse me, I'm sorry about my dog. But we've gone through a close review of public comments that were offered through the permit review process over the last couple of years. We've been doing oral history interviews, and we're also planning a survey of the community, which I'm not going to talk about today. Actually, some colleagues at LSU are taking the lead on that part. But with the public comments and oral history, we're working on mapping the data that we're acquiring from this qualitative process. And I'll be showing you some of that in a little while. So that's kind of where the first part of geospatial comes in. And of course, once we have our monitors laid out over our town, then we'll be able to do some other cool modeling with that. So anyway, so before we could start talking to people, NC State required that we make some plans to our protocol, and we received IRB approval for our activities, where we're recruiting community members, both through church pastors. This is a community where small churches play a really important role in the social fabric. That was actually one of the things that we've also found through our interviews. But also through our community contacts, we've been doing recruiting. Brenda has given us a number of names of people to talk with, but we're trying to also work around her as well so that we make sure that we're talking with a good representation of people from the town to make sure that we don't just have one vantage point represented. We are recording consent, so we have to go through a process of having each individual give consent before they do an interview. And so the consent happens over the phone. The consent is recorded, and so we have to capture the people saying that they will in fact participate, because it just worked out with our protocol. If we had mailed it, it would not be secure through first class mail. If we asked the residents to do any more than first class, it would be an impediment to some of our older study participants. The interviews were conducted by phone, so there was no contact whatsoever. And so I want to talk through a bit of the first part, which is our review of public comments. These were largely gathered from an extended meeting in July of 2018 when Clean Harbors was trying to go from a permit of 350 tons per year to 1,850, so about a 5-fold increase. And they wanted to increase their burn time from 5 minutes. So their allowed to basically put the waste on the plate, ignite it, and it's supposed to burn and be done in 5 minutes. They wanted to increase that to 60 minutes at a time. 875 pages were collected by the LDEQ, the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality, with oral comments, written exhibits, photos, and other materials that were submitted by community members. And so we went through a data extraction process where we went through these self-reported observations of smoke, noise, vibration, damage to homes, health issues that were self-reported, including thyroid, skin, respiratory disease, heart disease, and gastrointestinal problems, and the names and addresses of those contributing comments so that we could map them. And again, informing our sampler placement process in the next phase of this study, it helps to really see kind of where people are experiencing problems. I do want to make a point about these self-reported data. We kind of have this either or representation in the way that I'm going to be presenting this. Either a resident stated something to have observed it, or they did not state that they observed it, but it doesn't mean that they didn't make the observation. What I mean by that is if somebody were to give public comments and one person is talking about smoke and the second person doesn't say anything about smoke, it doesn't mean that they didn't see smoke. It just means that they chose to focus their comments around some other aspect of the problem, like noise or health. So we just took what was in the record and used that to create these maps that can indicate things like minimum spatial extent of the impact of this facility, but we can't use this to calculate something like prevalence because we would have to make the assumption that the lack of a statement about some phenomenon actually meant that they weren't experiencing it, and that would not be true. So among the 53 people who provided public comments, 47 stated their opposition to the expansion of clean harbors. 22 reported experiencing loud noises from the munitions detonation. 19 reported seeing smoke. 18 reported damage to their homes. 15 reported skin issues. 13 reported respiratory damage. 8 reported death or disappearance of animals. 7 reported heart disease. 7 reported thyroid, and 1 person reported a family death that they, again, testified they thought that was related to the facility. Again, this is self-reported information, so we're using this in a preliminary manner to lay the foundation for our study, rather than taking this to be the end-all be-all of health declarations. So for the 19 to have seen smoke, we can see on the map, and actually I have to take my glasses off and lean in. I hope you guys can see it. There are gray dots and black dots on the map. And I'm going to be showing you a few different maps in sequence over the next few minutes. But you can see the top left corner of the screen. So in the northwest portion of our vantage point, we can see Montgomery, Louisiana. The facility is noted with a star right in the middle. And then we keep going down into the parish south of Grant Parish, where Colfax is. And that's Rapides Parish. And even over the parish line, we can see a few people have testified there. And 1 person noted to have seen smoke. So this domain runs from the northwest down to the southeast over a distance of about 40 miles. Colfax actually is just about right in the middle. And then the Clean Harbors facility is about 5 miles directly north of the town of Colfax. But you can see from the dots that there are a number of homes. These are in a neighborhood called The Rock that are located just south or west, a couple that's north, and then a few that are east, but a couple of miles away. So you can see that there are some in pretty close proximity. Everywhere we see a black dot, a black circle, is where people have noted smoke to have occurred. So there are observations of smoke that are self-reported. And so this gives us a sense of how far the smoke might be traveling. I also wanted to just give you an idea of what that looks like. So we can see in the picture on the right, which was contributed by Ms. Martha Voda, that there is a pretty thick, dark plume that is emanating from the facility off in the distance, and you can see the extent to which this travels downstream. Again, having been at least visually observed as far as about 25 miles southeast of there. The next slide focuses on where people have stated to have experienced vibration or damage to their homes. And you can see that is mostly to the south and southeast of this facility. One person on the opposite shore of Lake Ayat, a couple of miles away from the facility, has experienced vibration or damage. But all the way down, even again, the same person had testified to that in Rapides County, about 25 miles southeast of the facility. Just to give you an idea of the type of damage that people noted, and most of it was in this close proximity area just south of the facility, but we can see in the picture on the right that the shaking is bad enough that someone's window frame came off. I heard reports of people's shelves shaking and things falling off the shelves in their house, things of that nature. Someone had their house on blocks. There were foundation blocks on the corners, and those blocks kind of shook out of place a little bit, causing one side of the home to actually sink in a bit. So some pretty severe vibration going on as a result of these explosions. 15 reported to have experienced skin damage. And what was interesting about that is that some people who stated that they experienced skin damage made a point to mention that they had not had that experience with any kind of rashes before Clean Harbors started ramping up their operation in the mid-2010s. We can see the reports of skin damage are mostly circling the facility. One person in the Montgomery area did note that as well. And the picture on the right is pretty gruesome. This shows you, this is provided by Mr. Henry Earl Moore of Colfax. He's got a tattoo on his arm, and then above it you can see these scars and wounds that he was attributing directly to the deposited material coming from the facility. So again, fairly gruesome stuff. 13 stated to have experienced respiratory damage. Again, most of those are in very close proximity to the facility, but a few further away. That same person in Rapides Parish, I think the other person in Montgomery, and what's shown here is just a picture of community members, just to kind of drive home the point that you've got an older population, but also children and grandchildren living in this community in close proximity. I'll just kind of go quickly through some of the others. 7 have reported thyroid damage, mostly in close proximity to the facility. 6 noted to have smelled a burning odor or electrical odor, again, mostly near the facility, but 1 a bit further out. 22 have stated to have experienced loud noises. In fact, a couple people who work nights have stated how disruptive that can be to hear explosions during the day. And you can see, unlike, if we flip back to the thyroid picture, they're all like fairly close in. But then when we look at the loud noises picture, you can see that this really extends broadly throughout the area. And we are going to be monitoring noise in addition to some of the air pollutant monitoring that we're planning in the near future. Last 8 stated that they have either felt when they were outside or seen particles deposit onto things like plants or, their property. So you can see here again, this is a really simple method. We basically just tabulated people's addresses and different things that they stated to have experienced, and plotted them up. And while this is not as advanced as a lot of the geospatial work that's going on in the CGA, you can see how this is a really useful planning tool before we step into a more intensive air monitoring phase. The other thing that I'll say that's coming out of this, and we could see as we're mapping the different health impacts, is that it gives us a clear idea of what kinds of materials we need to be monitoring for. I mentioned that this is a study about EPFRs. We know that EPFRs are formed through combustion processes, so it's certainly appropriate for what we're seeing. But after reviewing these records, we're going to be screening for, or I shouldn't say screening, we'll be sampling for a number of other types of particles, including carbonaceous particles, metals, dioxins, as a result of some of the activities going on and some of the impacts that people are seeing. And so it'll give us a broader picture of what people are being exposed to. We're also going to be looking at the size distribution of the particles, because how big a particle is determines where it goes within your respiratory system. Excuse me. So I want to share with you a little bit about the oral history interviews. This part of the work is still ongoing. We will be developing similar maps once we break down the information a little bit more, but this has been an important part of our first aim of our study, especially in lieu of the focus group meetings. So I mentioned earlier that we worked with the NC State IRB to gain their permission for our revised protocol. We read our consent forms over the phone. Everybody has to be fully aware of what we're doing with these interviews, how we're using the information, how much of the information about them can be public is up to the participant. And so the participants would record statements to say, yes, I agree with the plans, and then they would state their name and date as a proxy for their signature. We've been conducting interviews over the telephone, actually using Zoom telephones so that we could record them and capture a transcript. The phone call function in Zoom gets around the limitation because Colfax, as you saw, is up in a rural part of Louisiana. Some of the people that we interviewed are much older and don't use a computer, and we wanted to make sure that our study is accessible to anybody as long as they're over 18. We're not interviewing children, but provided that they're of age, we wanted to make sure that anybody could participate. We didn't want age or lack of familiarity with technology or lack of access to Wi-Fi to be an impediment. So we called people on their telephone, but using Zoom so we could capture it. Human subjects protection, such as redaction of third-party names, is also in place. We give participants the option of redacting their own name or the name of the facility. There were a few people who wanted to talk to us, but didn't want to say the facility name because they were worried about liability. And so our topics for discussion have included things like family history, job history, how the town has changed over the years, the health of the participants, and the air pollution that they have seen with their own eyes or somehow experienced. We consulted with a couple of oral historians. One is Blair Kelly in the history department here at NC State, and one of them is Jennifer Abraham Kramer at LSU. And they both gave us a lot of good insights on how to conduct interviews of this nature. Keeping them conversational tends to yield more authentic insights than just a strict question and answer. But we did have a set of questions handy to guide our conversation to make sure that we touched on all of the essential information that we need, particularly with regard to air pollution and health. The interviews provided insights on the historic conditions, which has really informed our understanding, not just about what people have seen in the last few years, but how the changes in the town over time have lent themselves to a facility like Clean Harbors really growing without notice for a long time, and then all of a sudden operating the way that they have. And we're going to be further mining those interviews to inform our sampling process that's going to be taking place in the next few months. So far, we've conducted 17 interviews. We've paused those interviews for now because it was getting to be late summer and Louisiana was hit with Hurricane Laura. And then we were getting ready to start back up with them in October. And then there was another hurricane that's come through. A third one has come through in recent days. I think that's the one we saw earlier today too, but I don't think that had a big impact on Colfax this time, luckily. But anyway, so we've conducted 17 so far. We plan to do a few more. One of the pastors we spoke with lives in Alexandria, but spends a lot of time in Colfax or The Rock, which again is that neighborhood just south of the facility, but north of the town proper of Colfax. 11 of our participants are Black, 6 are white, and that distribution pretty closely follows the demographic distribution in the town. In the census tract, there are 3,400 people. The town is a bit smaller than that, but we found the census tract data, 57% of the residents in that tract are Black, 43% are white. Median age is about 33 years old. Of our participants, 3 requested that their names be redacted, and the interviews ranged in time from 20 minutes to nearly 2 hours. Some of them were really quite interesting to go through. Some preliminary findings, just to give you an idea, are that small churches dominate the social fabric of the town. Some of the people we spoke with had ancestors who date back to the Colfax massacre, which happened in I shouldn't say late, through the Reconstruction era in the 1700s. I guess it was kind of as Reconstruction was going on, but basically there were shifting political winds in the state of Louisiana. There were, this is an aside, but there was some concern about by some of the white armed Democrats in the area, I'm reading, but of the white Democrats in the area that there was going to be an uprising and a loss of power by those who had traditionally held power. So many Black Republican freedmen had gathered in the courthouse and were basically trying to protect the vote because there was a vote to put into place some of the Republicans from parts of the state that were, well, from that part of the state, I should say, that were not well represented before that time. And so this massacre occurred when basically the 150 or so men who were holed up in this facility were brutally murdered. And so that was in the town of Colfax about the end of Reconstruction there. Some of the study participants also had ancestors who were sharecroppers in the town, and many interviewees had lived through school desegregation and noted that to be an important point in their lives. So they've seen a lot of upheaval. But then in about the 70s and 1980s, many noted this as a period of upward mobility in the town where people were gaining more political traction. There was more equity in the town than they had seen in previous years. And then over more recent years, the population started dwindling and the economy started dwindling, and employees had shared anecdotes of many young people moving out of town because there weren't a lot of opportunities in this small rural town in Louisiana. Socialization in the community largely depends on these small, mostly segregated churches in town. That's been a key tool in mobilization of the community against the Clean Harbors facility. And they formed this group, the Central Louisiana Coalition for a Clean and Healthy Environment, which I mentioned earlier. We can see a meeting on the pictured on the right. This is actually from that same ProPublica article as earlier. Brenda Valley, the leader, and the person who we've been in touch with most is standing towards the right in the door frame. And actually Wilma Subra, who is from the Louisiana Environmental Action Network and has been involved in many EJ studies in Louisiana over the years, is seen talking at the left to different community members. Just to give you a few insights that we had heard from the interviews, which we're still kind of breaking down. This is a quote from Terry Brown, who is a former state representative. He actually stepped down because he didn't want to deal with the political pressure that he was receiving to try to fight this facility in the state house. But he said, quote, "We used to hear when we were kids, we'd hear explosions coming from that, and we just assumed that that's where it's coming from. And gradually, they were getting louder and louder and louder. And we became aware that there was a place not far from Colfax that was burning munitions." So what he's talking about is how the company started slowly expanding their operations. They weren't really aware of it until in the mid-2010s, when all of a sudden, all of this waste was coming in from Camp Minden, from that closed military facility. And then they really started operating much more frequently and loudly, and it became this very prominent disturbance. Smoke was visible from many miles away. We hear from Grant Parish police juror Cephas Bowie. Police juror, by the way, is kind of like the same thing as a county assembly person. And he said, quote, "And I've seen the smoke, heard the bombings, and and everything when I'm up that way near Clean Harbors. But I can see the smoke from down where I live, about 10 miles from the facility." So he's basically saying that he's seeing the smoke where he is. And many described health issues. Just one example from Rebecca Lonadir, who is suffering from a couple of different thyroid conditions right now. She said, "One thing that really struck me, and it was just mind-boggling, is so many people with thyroid problems. Everybody has thyroid problems." And I noted before, 7 people had testified to thyroid, but again, we can't take those as prevalence type of numbers. It just gives us an idea of the community being impacted. So now we're pivoting towards measurements. So I think I mentioned we're going to be trying to take some more interviews so that we're sampling a larger swath of the community than we've met before. We're trying to get back to recruiting now. And all of these pieces of information are then informing how we place the samplers in the community and what we're monitoring for. So what we can see here are 2 layers on the map on the right, one of which is a satellite image of the area with Clean Harbors in the middle, and superimposed over that is a windrows. And so we can see that a lot of the wind does come from the south, so impacting some people who are directly north. About 20% of the winds come from the north and then directly impact the people in the rock area and in the town just below that. So the quality assurance banks we're going to be putting in place are going to contain a number of monitors altogether. There'll be 2 of these kinds of sites where there are high quality PM 2.5 monitors that actually suck using a high volume pump material onto filters. And then we're going to be analyzing that material in the laboratory. We're going to couple that with a low cost sensor and an array of passive samplers that are going to be basically split up and analyzed for different things, one of which for particle size distribution, because we only get a kind of a subset of the particles from the active sampling from the high volume sampling. So we'll get size distribution, we'll get metals composition, the EPFRs, that there's environmentally persistent free radicals that are the impetus for this study. And we're looking at gases as well as particles. I think we're definitely going to be measuring semi-volatile organic compounds. We may or may not measure some lighter gases as well. We are still deciding that, and it's based a bit also on what we're reading as we're going through these interviews again. The low-cost sensors are going to be corrected because low-cost sensors are low-cost for a reason. So there are some data deficiencies with those, but they do a really good job of capturing fluctuations over time. So they'll capture the ups and downs of the concentrations, but not necessarily as accurately as we'd like. So we're working on a data correction algorithm. That's actually something that's been an active area of air pollution research over the last few years. And we're going to use those low-cost sensors because they're continuous electronic monitors to report data back to the community through an app that Makiko is developing that I'll talk about in a second. And then the last thing is this passive sampler array, which we're going to be placing in more locations around the area. So I think right now we're planning to sample in 24 locations in this fairly small area so that we have a fairly dense picture. But going back, and I'm not going to flip back and forth in the slides, but just remember in your mind how much of the population who at least came and testified were oriented along that northwest to southeast incline that sort of followed the Red River. And so we're going to be sure to use the data about density of the observations to inform exactly how far away we put them. We may use a little bit more of an objective placement algorithm to make sure that we're capturing a wide enough swath that we're not only sticking with the people's observations, but that we're making sure to include those so that we know that those are captured. And the mapping is going to inform, as I said, the density of the samplers and the size of the domain. And these histories and comments have really been instrumental in teaching us what to look for. Just a couple more slides, I'm almost done. Our next step, or a concurrent step, is mobile application development. And Makiko Shukunobe from the Center for Geospatial Analytics, as I mentioned, is taking the lead on this. The app is going to have several functions, including reporting that continuous data corrected back to the community. But it's also going to be taking in some health symptom data from the community. If anybody notes severe symptoms such as chest pain or shortness of breath, that could be indicative of a heart attack, they'll be informed that they should call 911, and a link to 911 will pop up. But mostly what we'll do with that information is log it and collect it in such a way that we can report that back to the community. But then we can also see those data and see if we can correlate that with the operations data from our continuous monitors. And we can look at our passive samplers and our high volume sampler to look at what's being released. And then the low cost sensors with good time variation will tell us the frequency, and we can look at that in close relationship to the data that people input through this app. At the same time, we didn't want to just take from the community, we want to give to the community. So we wanted to let people know what others in the community are experiencing, with in mind the need to protect personal information. So we're going to have zip code averaged symptom, I don't want to say prevalence, but as far as the percent who are operating this app, what percentage report certain problems that could be due to things associated with the facility, or they could be due to generalized health issues. We're not making that distinction right now because we want to see where the data lead us when we start to analyze it. But we are asking about a swath of information. We're also going to be doing a one-time health survey when people do the first initial setup of the app on their phone, so that we can understand how their symptoms may also relate to underlying problems. We're going to be, in addition to reporting back air quality data to residents, we'll be collecting also any kind of self-reported incidents of environmental problems. So you can see this incident report page example where someone will enter basically where they saw a problem. There'll be a timestamp on it that shows the date and time. Someone can check from a few options to show what they've noted, whether it be smoke or noise or vibration or deposition of particles, for example, and they'll have an opportunity to upload a picture. So people in the community can scroll through this and have their own record of things that are going on. But then there'll also be a link to the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality website where people can register complaints, and then they can easily use the form that the LDEQ has to set up a complaint if they choose to do that. So in conclusion, health issues and environmental damage have been documented through several venues in the Rock and Colfax. We're working on trying to add more context to that through our interviews. The mapping is an important tool for documenting observations and symptoms that inform air quality measurement design. And these measurements will in turn help to substantiate the community's complaints to support their efforts. And that is all I have, but I am more than happy to answer questions if anybody's still awake.
Wonderful, Jen. Thank you. It's really fascinating and important what you're taking on down there.
Thanks.
Yeah. We have about 8 minutes for questions. Let's see, you can line things up in the chat box and I can just call on you to answer questions, or feel free to just jump in.
Sure. I mean, anybody should feel free to unmute and ask if they'd like.
Hi, Jennifer. This is Perver. What
Hi.
has been the most challenging part of this work so far?
I think so far, I mean, you know, we did a lot of scrambling over the summer to try to revise our plans. So that was one challenge. Once we knew we were going to be funded, and COVID really kind of cropped up right after that. And so our proposal had laid out these other plans. And so we had a lot of scrambling, a lot of quick going back to the drawing board as far as how we design getting these community insights and going back through the approval process and all of that. So that's definitely been a challenge. But I think as far as the interviews so far, the challenge is really in trying to recruit people from afar. We were hoping to be able to, you know, if we were in town for a few days, show up at a church at the end of the service and tell people about what we were doing so that they would feel a little bit more comfortable talking with us. But from doing this from afar, we're a bit more subject to the whims of our contacts there. And so we're trying to work around that by contacting organizations in the town, like the town hall, to see if we can talk to anybody who works there. The school, there is one elementary school. They're kind of on a county system, not totally unlike Wake County, but Grant Parish has most of their schools outside of Colfax because it's not a major population point anymore. and but there's one elementary there, so we've been trying to talk with people who work there. The hurricanes, as I said, kind of have held up that process, but that's been a big issue with the interviews, is just trying to make sure we're talking to more people so that we're not just saturated with one story, and that we're capturing enough of the experience of the community that we're making sure that we can represent that community well when we go in with our monitors.
Great, thanks.
Sure. Good question. Thank you. Any other questions?
Jen, I can imagine the work you're doing would be really relevant to communities in other regions facing air pollution or other types of problems. How easy would it be to transfer your approach and the app you're developing to other places?
That's a great question. So I want to kind of just disengage those for a minute and start with the approach. I think the histories that we're doing, we're really excited about that as a way to try to kind of merge this qualitative data collection process with our air quality planning and kind of this sort of informed approach to sampling. So I think that's something that we'd like to put together a publication or two about that this year. We have some ideas about how we're going to be doing that. And as we're breaking down the interview information and the public comments a bit more, we're going to be working on that. Now, as far as the app, I think that's an area I've seen other apps in different areas. I don't think it's quite as new, but I do think that there are new aspects to what we're doing, particularly having the daily kind of health information intake, but trying to use that to report back to the community. Over this summer, I guess it was around May or so, I learned about a study of COVID. It was trying to use big data to predict COVID outbreaks in areas. And they developed, it wasn't an app, but it was a website that they would email you a daily reminder. We're using an app rather than a website, mostly because more people have cell phones than computers. And even in our conversations with Colfax, other than some people who really don't use new technologies, a lot of people do use their cell phones for apps and things like that. But this website, back to what I was saying, would ask just a few simple questions. And so I got in touch with the person who was running that study. It turned out is somebody who lives in Durham. But basically, they had an approach where the people would get a daily reminder and just have as simple as questions as possible. And the questions were taken from other health studies so that the question structure was well validated. And so we can use a lot of those principles and just kind of build on that. So it's not really starting things from scratch, but trying to learn what's been done and make a tool that's really accessible to the community. And so we hope that that kind of innovation has room for growth. I think the one part that's really new in our approach is the part where people are reporting air quality data, not data, but their personal observations into the system, so that we're developing a database when people see smoke or smell things and things of that nature. And we're hoping that that will correlate with the measurements that we're taking so that we can develop a more, a fuller picture of what's going on there.
Cool. Well, I really look forward to following how the project evolves.
Good.
Yeah.
Since Mikiko's working on it.
It's really doing something that matters, which I like.
Thanks. Thanks a lot. I appreciate that.
Well, we're at the end of the hour, so I will, I guess, adjourn us. John, do you have any announcements to share?
I just wanted to echo your thanks to Jen for the great presentation. And remind everybody that there is a social hour following the forum, and I am pasting the Zoom link into the chat window. So thanks again, Jen. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And for the reasons we discussed before, I'm gonna have to miss the social, but thank you for the opportunity to talk. I hope that we can come back and maybe Martina will be able to present in another year and a half or so what we're getting in the community.
Can't
So thanks.
wait.
It's good to see all of you, or see your pictures anyway.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Jen. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you.